Dr. Qamar Cheema, and I'm honored to have with me Mr. Hassan Butt. Mr. Hassan Butt is an associate professor at the George Mason University, and he has written a book, Secession and Security Explaining State Strategy Against Separatists. That was published by the Cornell University, and his area of research is very vast about ethnicity and nationalism, South Asia. But recently, he wrote what we call it as a commentary or analysis at the United States Institute of Peace about that the South Asia must talk on climate. So I requested Mr. Hassan to please spare some time for talking with me. Thank you very much, sir, for your time.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. So you wrote at the United States Institute of Peace about this is time for South Asia to talk climate. So what motivated you to talk, right? That South Asia should talk on climate because South Asia is not talking on anything else. So what do you think that they can talk on climate, or do you find that there is some probability that this is a shared responsibility of all the nations in the region because this is not something an issue of a single country. As Pakistan's climate change minister, Ms. Sherry Rahman said, this time this is Pakistan, next time this could be someone else. So, how did you find that this is a shared responsibility, and what motivated you? And do you believe that there could be some kind of a cooperation for talking on climate?
Yeah. So let me answer your first question of how I got motivated to write this. If I could take a little bit of time, I would actually go back a few years to roughly 2019. I was always interested in issues of climate change as an observer and as a global citizen. But probably my expertise or my analysis or my scholarly work didn't go in that direction. But I was always very interested in it. And I remember sitting at a panel at a think tank here in DC on, it was right after the sort of the last Pakistan India sort of episode in 2019 with the fighter pilots and the fighter jets and all of that stuff. And so there was a panel on nuclear deterrence after that. And one of the things that struck me while I was sitting at that panel was how many other panels like that I've sat on in the past on Kashmir, terrorism, nuclear weapons. These two or three issues sort of keep coming up again and again, certainly in Washington, D.C., when it comes to South Asia. And I remember thinking at that panel, wow, I've never actually sat on a panel that actually deals with uh, like the real threat to this region, which is climate. It's always these two or three same things that are sort of been going on for a long, long time. So that's when sort of the idea popped in my head that more people should be talking about this. I didn't immediately go to it, but it was in the back of my mind that more people should be talking about this. The next couple of years, I looked around and I saw that there weren't, frankly, that many international relations people or regional politics people who were really writing about this. So I thought that there was some sort of a need, maybe a space, maybe however you want to define it, for someone else to come and talk about it. So that was the basic motivation. With respect to sort of can they talk about it? Are they talking about it? I actually disagree. As far as I understand, Pakistan and India are currently in track to back channel diplomacy. It's a good thing it's not on the front pages, probably. But they are talking, and they are talking, as far as I can understand, about big important things like Kashmir again. But as I suspect, my suspicion is that in these back channel talks, Pakistan and India are not talking about climate, which I think is a mistake. Um, I certainly, as your introductory sort of comments made clear, this is the biggest threat by far to the 2 billion people that live in South Asia. And it's a threat that unites us, unlike every other issue that South Asia seems to plague South Asia, whether we talk about Kashmir or nuclear weapons, terrorism, whatever. This is one issue where the three big countries, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, as well as the smaller countries, Nepal, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, etc. This is one issue where all of them seem to have relatively consonant issues and views. So there's really a lot of room for cooperation. Now, obviously, you're right that there's a lot of things to do before we get to that point where we're actually cooperating. And I think the thrust of your question is correct that it'll take a lot for us to get there. But certainly, I do think it's a very, very important area for cooperation. And I think there's a lot of room for growth in this area. And this is one area where, for once, South Asian countries are not employed in some sort of zero-sum game, but rather a positive sum game. So that's the basic angle from which I come at this.
Hmm. So, you have written in your article that obviously the South Asia is the least integrated and known as most geographically, geopolitically dysfunctional region in the world. So, what do you suggest that there should be the talks in the among the regional countries should be either from a multilateral platforms, or do you believe that bilateral talks?
So you just cut out there for a second. I think your
Yeah.
question was, is the cooperation better at a multilateral platform? And then you cut out for a second.
Oh, yeah. Or do you believe that the leadership needs to come up with the bilateral engagements?
Yeah, no, I definitely favor multilateral in this area. I think one of the issues is that, and we've seen this historically with SARC in the so you talk about the lack of integration and the geopolitical dysfunction. Whether it's a cause or a symptom, I'm not sure, but one thing for sure is that regional institutional bodies like SARC are basically dead. I mean, they're almost worse than useless. Right? And one of the reasons those regional institutions bodies are dead, unlike in places like, North America or even Latin America or Europe or Southeast Asia, is the India-Pakistan relationship and the the deep reservoirs of poison that infect the India-Pakistan relationship. And so everything in the South Asia region ends up sort of being like a product of, bad ties between India and Pakistan. And so SARC is one of those unfortunate, uh, uh, casualties of that. And so anything that is like organized around a bilateral framework tends to fail, frankly, in South Asia, because India and Pakistan don't have the political maturity to, put aside certain issues and talk about other issues the way other countries can. Right? Like China and Japan, for instance, have all sorts of disagreements about history, but they also trade in the billions of dollars every year, right? Like tens of billions of dollars every year, right? So, like India, Pakistan can't do that or don't do that. So my point is that bilateral tries and bilateral arrangements thus far in the last 75 years have been, with the ironic exception of the Indus Waters Treaty, uh, bilateral frameworks have tended to fail. So I definitely favor multilateral frameworks for that reason. I also favor multilateralism because I think one of the big, I don't know if you want to call it a problem or a challenge but one of the big drawbacks of regional approaches in the past, as I said, has been it sort of gets subsumed under this India-Pakistan dyad, whereas, in the last 25 years, Bangladesh, frankly, has become economically on a GDP per capita basis richer than both India and Pakistan. So that's one issue. We're leaving aside Bangladesh, countries like Afghanistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka, who are at different ends of the spectrum socioeconomically. For instance, Sri Lanka is way better off than both India and Pakistan, for instance. Afghanistan is worse off. But either way, those countries have a voice and need to be involved. Sri Lanka is an island nation. Maldives is a series of islands. Like those countries need to be strongly involved in any discussions on climate. Afghanistan is threatened by heat. Nepal is where all of these glaciers are, and the Himalayan range. So there definitely needs to be more of a multilateral approach. And then finally, the one thing I'd say is when we talk about water, which is the really the sort of ground zero of climate change, whether we're talking about droughts, whether we're talking about floods, whether we're talking about uh, you know uh, sweet water versus salt water, all the stuff for agriculture and living. Um, Water is really the ground zero of climate change. And when we think of water sources in South Asia, there is no water source that is only for one country, right? When we think of the three big rivers in the region, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Indus, they all traverse multiple countries, sometimes three or four countries. Um, so there really is no bilateral approach that can be taken here. certainly a multilateral problem, and it requires multilateral solutions.
Mm. So, what is important right now that the three big countries in the region are Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh. Obviously, in one of your arguments, you have spoken that what is important is that to share data and information is necessary. How do you think that it is possible? For instance, we believe that over the period of time, somehow India and Pakistan and the other regional countries they started sharing data or some information when it comes to the threats from the non-state actors. How do you think that the confidence building measures could be taken that at least the data is shared, information is shared? What do you suggest, for example, to these three countries? Although it is necessary for all the Himalayan countries to share the data because they just get affected what is happening in the Himalayas. So, how do you see that? How come they can engage more by sharing data and information? That's how which is necessary for formulating the policy.
Yeah, great question. So I think one of the big differences between something like you talked about terrorism, I think one of the big differences between something like terrorism and climate change is the zero sum versus positive sum uh, issue, right? So when it comes to terrorism, and we don't have to get into the details, but when it comes to terrorism, historically, India and Pakistan have been at loggerheads, right? So the things that India wants Pakistan to do, Pakistan doesn't want to do, or Pakistan has to be sort of forced to do or convinced to do. Um, so there's a natural sort of reluctance there, right? In that what's good for one country may not necessarily be good for the other country as the decision makers in that country see it. Uh, However, climate is a different ball game in that you're not really losing anything per se by sharing data, right? So that's why I think it's a relatively what I call it a low hanging fruit. That this is something relatively simple to do. Simple doesn't mean it's easy, but it doesn't require a whole host of groundbreaking, political changes or anything. One thing I would say, however, is that uh, data sharing, information sharing doesn't have to be in the hands of the big ministries and the big capitals and the big presidents and prime ministers and big personalities, because anytime something gets subsumed into those types of relations, the stakes get very high. And so anytime there's a problem, you can break that off, for instance, right? So if it's at the prime minister level or the president level, you don't want it to be at the prime minister level or president level because it's very easy to say the wrong thing on a totally unrelated topic, and suddenly all the momentum is lost and that's taken away as well. What I would suggest is something at a much lower level, at the bureaucrat level, at the activist level, at the scientist level, at the journalist level, where the stakes are much lower. There's ways of engaging with one another without necessarily drawing in these big India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Dhaka, New Delhi, Islamabad style conversations that end up being very, very weighty, like I said, which increase the stakes. So my suggestion would be that something like data sharing, information sharing is much easier if scientists are in charge, if activists are in charge, and you don't need government machinery to share data. Just to give you one small example that I was talking about in the article as well. Uh, India and Bangladesh, for instance, or India and Nepal, a lot of times what happens is you have communities or river communities on one side of the border sharing data from WhatsApp with river communities on the other side of the border, on WhatsApp groups. So you don't need necessarily big government agencies involved. If anything, I think big government agencies will actually harm rather than help these efforts. So that's my basic take on data sharing.
Mm. So coming to the last one question, and that is that recently we have heard that there is a discussion about the global south. And for instance, Pakistan, after the floods here in Pakistan, wherever it went at the global stage, it asked for that the global north, let's say $100 billion for this money. So how do you see that? That money could be channeled into to the countries like Pakistan or Nepal or Bangladesh or India because we are all getting affected with this. Although Pakistan's definition of the global south and India's definition of the global south is different, but I think Pakistan is using this global south as per getting money
Yeah.
from the great players because they believe that's the only way to get money. And one more thing is that how to separate, because largely whatever the foreign flows in Pakistan are there because either because of the terrorism and so on, so the financial aid and all that, and that has been used for the political purposes or for the electoral campaigns in that fact. So how not to politicize the money that is to come from from the global north to mitigate the threats of the climate.
Yeah, great question. So on the first issue, the first thing I'd say is I'd commend our Minister for Climate, Sherry Rahman, who I think has done a fantastic job of bringing global attention, most not least at the recent climate conference in Egypt, on the plight of Pakistan and on the plight of global South in general. And I think Sherry Rahman needs to be commended for this. And I don't think it's a coincidence that someone like her could do this because she's very well connected, not in the sense of having a personal network per se, although I'm sure she has that as well, but connected in the sense of ideationally, like she understands the language, she understands the idioms and the just the sort of the common knowledge that the rest of the world has about certain issues. So she speaks that language and she can speak to people in their language. And so I think that's really important. She's on Twitter. She understands global debates. She's a global citizen, and so in that sense, we're very lucky to have her in the position that she's in. Um, Certainly, I think this is a much larger question. I don't think this is a question just for Pakistan. This question of sort of the so-called loss and damage fund uh, that has been recently been instituted at at the COP conference, in part due to the efforts of Sherry Rahman. This loss and damage fund conversation has been happening for a long time. It's been happening since Kyoto, arguably since before Kyoto. I think the floods in Pakistan have brought into sharp relief just how big a deal it is, because it is a deeply moral and ethical uh, conundrum, right? Like in the sense that the rich countries that cause climate change, and poor countries are the ones paying for it. So the moral and ethical case is very clear. Uh, the political case is obviously much harder. But I think thanks to people like Shahir Rahman, and I think thanks to this momentum over the last 20 years, uh, on this question. We're further advanced than we were maybe a generation ago. One cautionary note I would say, however, is like a lot of times rich countries pledge money, and then that money is not always delivered. I believe in the aftermath of Paris or Copenhagen, I forget which one, but there was something similar. Maybe it wasn't called a loss and damage fund, but it was something similar of sort of a set of payments to go from rich countries to poor countries, and they pledged $100 billion a year and ended up delivering something like 80 billion. So, a lot of times rich countries talk a good game, but don't always walk the talk. So I think that part remains to be seen. But certainly the momentum towards acknowledging the responsibility of the global north towards the global south, I think has advanced quite considerably in the recent past. So that's one thing I'd say. On your second question of how do you not politicize this, and I think you also brought up terrorism aid and things like that. Again, that goes back to sort of, zero sum versus positive sum and then bilateral versus multilateral. I think a lot of times when Pakistan has gotten itself into trouble, or if you don't want to use the trouble where, if you don't want to use the word trouble, where Pakistan's incoming aid flows, let's put it that way, have been subject to political scrutiny. I think it's generally, as you say, when it's revolved around things like terrorism, Taliban, Al Qaeda, and when it comes from the US and the so-called do more, this idea that we're giving you money, so why don't you fight the war that we want you to fight? And I think that's a very, very different framework than a multilateral engagement where Pakistan is not dealing with the US as one country against another country on this very specific topic of terrorism, where they have very different stances, despite despite ostensibly sharing a goal of dismantling Taliban, Al Qaeda in the 2000s. Obviously, as we know in the real world, those goals weren't always shared, especially when it came to the Taliban. Uh, and so there were real political differences there that would be reflected in the issues over aid, right? Whereas here, given it's a multilateral framework and given it's not a US-Pakistan thing, it's a global North versus global South thing. And so Pakistan is one country in the global South, but as Sherry Rahman said, tomorrow it could be Yemen, tomorrow it could be, a country in Africa the day after that, it could be a country in South Asia next week, Southeast Asia next week. Uh, so I think that sort of deflects the the pressure of this sort of bilateral engagement on something as weighty as terrorism. Now, if you go back to the post 9/11, the 10 years after 9/11, for instance, those 15 years after 9/11, terrorism was the number one foreign policy priority of like every US president coming in, right? And so like there was a lot of the stakes were very, very high. Let's put it that way. And so any partnership that revolved around terrorism would by definition be very vulnerable to political tensions and political winds. Whereas, as I said, with climate, it's a much more diffused phenomenon where it's not one country dealing with another country; it's one set of countries dealing with another set of countries. So, my hope is, and my expectation is that that type of money flowing in would be subject less to these types of ebbs and flows and this type of sensitivity where one year it's in the tens of billions and next year they totally turn it off. My hope or expectation is that uh, it would not observe those types of trends.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hassan Bhatt, for your time for the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for